You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we finally got some news that we've been waiting for here as far as Donald Trump's conviction and sentencing are concerned in his New York trial. Can you explain what just happened here?
Yeah, Brian, we were waiting for Judge Merchan, who's presiding over Donald Trump's case in which he was convicted by a jury of 34 felony crimes that he committed to try to cheat in the 2016 presidential election. We thought we were going to get the big ruling from Judge Merchan about whether those guilty verdicts had to be thrown out because of the Supreme Court's absolute presidential immunity ruling, or whether they could proceed to sentencing. And instead, what we got is Judge Merchan saying, I'm going to give you all one more week. And he set it over for November 19th. And the reason he did that was because, believe it or not, both the prosecutors in Alvin Bragg's office and Donald Trump's defense attorneys jointly said, listen, he was just elected president, and now we have to figure out what the new rules and the new legalities might be regarding going to sentencing against somebody who is now president-elect. And so Judge Merchan said, fair enough, I'm going to give you one more week. But as of right now, Brian, we're still expecting to have Judge Merchan make that ruling about whether they can proceed to sentencing or whether he has to throw out all 34 felony convictions because the Supreme Court said president is essentially a king and can never be held criminally accountable for much of what he does while in office. I'm sure our viewers are already thinking to themselves, but wait a minute, he committed most of these crimes back in 2016 before he was in office. Bingo. That's a great point, and one that the prosecutors have driven home, which is frankly why I expect Judge Merchan to ultimately rule that these 34 felony convictions survive the Supreme Court's presidential immunity ruling. And then the next question becomes, okay, if they survive, then we need to sentence Donald Trump on those 34 felony crimes, right? To which I'm afraid I'm going to have to say, not so fast. That might not be the way it plays out.
Well, to that point then, I mean, we have kind of two options right in front of us here. There's either that he moves forward to sentencing, or what happens in the other side. Could they, A, be thrown away, or B, are they just paused until after Donald Trump's presidential term?
Yeah, great question. And I think there's probably an A, a B, and a C. So A is Judge Merchan rules in a way we're not expecting. And he says, you know what, I've got to dismiss all 34 convictions because of the Supreme Court ruling. I think that unlikely. But if he does that, the case is essentially over. Now, technically, the prosecutors, Alvin Bragg's state court prosecutors, could begin the appeals process of that decision, but I think that's not terribly likely, and even if they did, it probably wouldn't be successful in any event. The other thing Judge Merchan can do is what I'm expecting him to do, rule that, nope, the 34 felony convictions survive the Supreme Court ruling, let's go to sentencing. In which case, Donald Trump's lawyers will probably try to immediately appeal and put a stop to the sentencing, which is presently scheduled for November 26th. And because the prevailing wisdom and the law and the procedure says that when a judge makes a decision on an immunity issue, that is generally immediately appealable by the defendant who suffers the loss when it comes to that ruling. So I have a feeling that's what Donald Trump's lawyer's next move will be. And then Judge Merchan will have to make the decision, okay, do I try to proceed to sentencing anyway, or do I just put the whole thing on pause? And I think the pause is likely. Here is the other thing that could happen. Let's assume that he denies the motion to dismiss. He says, I'm proceeding to sentencing, and then Donald Trump's lawyers appeal it. Donald Trump's lawyers have also filed a motion to dismiss, not just because of the presidential immunity ruling, but because he's been elected president. And the prevailing wisdom and the law in this area basically says if a state court prosecutor wants to proceed in a case against a sitting president, that prosecution has to pause until after that sitting president leaves office. So the other thing that could happen is Judge Merchan could say, okay, fine, I'm not dismissing. You go ahead and file your appeal, and here's what we're going to do. We're literally going to put this case in hibernation. We're going to have it pause for the entire time Donald Trump is the sitting president, and the minute he leaves office, the case will be revived and he will be sentenced. So that is another possibility. And actually, Brian, it's a lawful possibility. Whether Donald Trump would stand for it if he took office and became the day one dictator he has promised to become is anybody's guess. But those are the different options moving forward.
All right, well, Glenn, to that point, I mean, is it possible if Judge Merchan goes forward with the sentencing that we could actually see Donald Trump sentenced here, that sentence itself put on pause, put on ice, and then, January 21st, 2029, he might be responsible for reporting to the Bureau of Prisons for a 12-month prison term?
Brian, it's possible, but unlikely. I'm going to go to a greater possibility. Now, yes, Judge Merchan could say, I don't care that I'm supposed to pause the proceedings once you appeal my immunity decision. I'm going to go ahead and sentence you anyway, but not impose the sentence. That's called staying execution of the sentence. That's a thing in the law. I think that less likely. Here's what I think is a little bit more likely, and it would still provide some good news on the justice front, or maybe some light at the end of the tunnel. So Judge Merchan could refuse to dismiss it based on presidential immunity and based on the fact that he's president-elect. But he could pause the case and say, Trump, your lawyers, go ahead and file your appeal. Let the case remain in effect while that case goes up and down the appellate chain. And then assuming the case survives appeal, then Judge Merchan can say, okay, now we're going to leave the case on pause the entire time, and I'm going to set your sentencing date for, what would it be, January 2029, January 20th at, 1 p.m.
1 p.m., right. Yeah.
Shortly after you leave office. Obviously, that's, not going to happen precisely that way. But then Donald Trump would literally have his sentencing date hanging over his head the whole 4 years that he's in the presidency. And here's the thing. If you ask me if that's how the rule of law should apply, I would say yes. That makes perfect sense. Do I believe the rule of law will win the day and will be applied that way? Well, with Donald Trump willing to engage in any number of, abuses of the rule of law, weaponizing his Department of Justice, and perhaps worse, again, I think it unlikely, but certainly lawful and possible.
On that point, is there any way that this sentencing could be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court? Right now it's in the New York state court system. Is there any way that it could jump into the federal court system and get appealed up to the Supreme Court where they could protect him? And B, the question that everybody has, I think, is there any way more broadly, even if that's not the case, or even if it is, that Donald Trump could use the DOJ to prevent sentencing, which may be frozen, while he's president?
So to answer the first question, he could certainly jump into the federal system, and here's why. He is going to be making a separation of powers argument. Boiled down to its essence, he's going to say, listen, I know the state court is prosecuting me under state law. I am now the president-elect, and the Constitution says if there's ever a conflict between state court laws and federal laws, guess what? Federal laws win. So therefore, I should not be susceptible to a state court prosecution. That has the feel of a federal question that the Supreme Court would probably be really interested in taking up. So ultimately, could he jump from the state court appellate system into the federal system? I think that is a likelihood, quite frankly, if push comes to shove. And then your second question, Brian, could Trump use the DOJ to somehow interfere in the state court prosecution? Not lawfully, but it's Donald Trump. And look what he did, last time he was in power to corrupt and weaponize the Department of Justice to try to override the will of the voters in various battleground states. But here's the other thing, and I even hate to end with this, but Donald Trump said he is entirely happy to use the military to go after his political enemies and opponents. So I just think, given everything Donald Trump has said, he will probably go to great lengths, lawful, unlawful, constitutional, unconstitutional, to stop all criminal proceedings against him.
Well, one way or the other, we are going to have some more news 1 week from now on November 19th when we hear again from Judge Merchan. Is that correct?
That is right.
Okay, well, we will bring that to you as soon as we have that news for those who are watching right now, if you want to follow along. And if you want to stay with us in this broader fight that we're going to be engaged in, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.